I'm Nima Rajan. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau will jet off to Europe this morning for a 6-day trip, during which he will tout Canada's promises on climate change and COVID-19 recovery. His first stop will be an official visit to the Netherlands before flying to Rome for the G20 Leaders Summit, and then to Glasgow, Scotland for the United Nations COP26 climate meeting. Well, meanwhile, there are indications the Liberals' climate plan could meet Canada's greenhouse gas emissions targets for the first time before the end of this decade. A study by Clean Prosperity took a look at all of Prime Minister Trudeau's recent climate policies, and it says they could get Canada's emissions to 41% below what they were in 2005 by 2030. That would be just within reach of the new 40 to 45% target he set last spring. The Vatican has issued a brief statement saying Pope Francis is willing to come to Canada. This as part of the process of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Mark Miller says the Indigenous peoples want the Pope to fully and completely recognize the harm the Catholic Church caused in residential schools.
As a non-Catholic, I have a lot of discomfort, and I've been quite clear on what I expect the Holy Father to do with respect to Indigenous peoples, but imposing conditions on a religious order as a minister of the Crown is something that I do with a lot of trepidation, and I think all these things can be discussed. And obviously, the request that have been made is quite clear. I truly believe in the good faith of the Holy Father.
A new survey has looked into land acknowledgements by hockey teams. The online survey of over 1,500 people was conducted by Leger Marketing for the Association for Canadian Studies. It found that support for land acknowledgements was strongest in Ontario, with 52% of respondents in favor. And it was the weakest in Quebec, with 31% of respondents in favor. It also found stronger support for the acknowledgements among Anglophones at 46% than Francophones at 28%. And it was the same trend among women at 48% than men at 38%. Conservative leader Erin O'Toole says his caucus has accepted the requirement that members of Parliament be vaccinated against COVID-19. This or have a medical exemption in order to take their physical seat in the House of Commons.
Today, the Conservative caucus met. I put forward a plan, and the caucus agreed to respect and abide by new rules which require parliamentarians attending the House of Commons and Senate to be vaccinated. At the earliest opportunity, a question of privilege will be raised in the House of Commons to challenge the improper conduct and precedent set by the Board of Internal Economy in their meeting on October 19th. Only the House of Commons itself can determine its composition and its conduct.
Mr. O'Toole made the remarks after a caucus meeting. All right, well, the incoming mayor of the small and remote Yukon town of Faro says the magnitude of the shooting deaths of 2 people is only just starting to sink in. Jack Bowers says grief and shock are rippling throughout the community of 400 people. The RCMP says bounties were called Tuesday to probe a domestic dispute. This was before receiving further reports of gunfire that left 2 people dead and 1 man critically injured.
As I've stated earlier, 2 individuals are deceased, 1 woman, age 42, 1 man, age 73, and 1 man is being treated for critical injuries and is in stable condition at this time. At this point, we will not be releasing the names of the victims out of respect for the families.
61-year-old Ralph Shaw is charged with 2 counts each of first-degree murder, attempted murder, and aggravated assault. It appears Canadian fossil fuel producers receive more public financial support than any in the developed world. A study by Oil Change International adds up loans, loan guarantees, grants, share purchases, and insurance coverage provided to fossil fuel producers by governments and other agencies. And it found Canada topped the subsidies list, providing producers an average of almost $14 billion a year between 2018 and 2020. That's about 14 times as much support as it provided to renewable energy. Starbucks Canada says it's raising wages and benefits amid critical staffing shortages and a renewed commitment to the well-being of its workers. Beginning in January, the company says starting wages will be increased to $1 above provincial minimums. This while workers who have been in the company a year will receive a 6 to 10% pay hike. It says the wage boost will bring the hourly pay for baristas to between $13 and $20.45 an hour, depending on location and tenure, and a few dollars more for shift supervisors. All right, we'll be right back with a look at the cost of Justin Trudeau's newly sworn-in cabinet. We'll have an interview with Mr. Franco Terrazzano, the federal director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, up next. And, of course, more news from around the world only on Forum Daily News. Stay tuned. Canada's newly sworn-in federal cabinet held its first meeting yesterday. The new cabinet is larger than it was previously, with 39 members, including the Prime Minister. 9 of those members are new faces to cabinet. But as the number of people in cabinet grows, the cost of cabinet salaries is also rising. The latest report by the Canadian Taxpayers Federation finds salary costs for cabinet have grown by $3 million since 2015. And it comes as another report finds Canada's tax system is becoming less competitive than its peers. Well, Mr. Franco Terrazzano, the federal director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, joins us now to talk more on this. Sir, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Thanks for having me on.
So what is the current salary cost for cabinet, and how does that compare to previous years?
The current costs are $10.8 million every year, which is $3 million more than the cabinet that Trudeau first swore in back in 2015.
And have officials given any reason behind this rising cost? And just to clarify, how does all of this impact Canadian taxpayers?
Well, bigger salaries plus more ministers mean higher costs for taxpayers coming at the worst possible time. Now, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, he is going to receive $371,000. Ministers will be receiving $274,000. So those are big salaries. But the real slap in the face to taxpayers is that all of our members of parliament received 2 pay raises during the pandemic. So the Prime Minister will be receiving $13,800 more than pre-COVID-19, while ministers will be receiving $10,100 more than pre-pandemic.
And to add to that, we know the CTF came out with a report today on carbon taxes and how they relate to gas prices. So tell us a little bit more about that, sir.
Well, the report shows what these current gas prices would mean with the future carbon tax hikes that are coming down the pipe. Now, we're all struggling with the high gas prices, so we should see politicians giving us some tax relief at the pumps, but the Trudeau government is moving in the wrong direction. And Trudeau's massive carbon tax hike by 2030 will add about 40 cents per liter to the price of gas, but he's also imposing a second carbon tax, which would add up to 11 cents per liter to the price of gas. So if you look at current gas prices in Toronto and you add in these massive future carbon tax hikes, then the total bill for a family to fuel up their minivan would be about $145.
And taking these taxes into consideration, we know the International Tax Competitiveness Index for 2021 recently came out. So tell us a little bit more about what this report measures and what exactly tax competitiveness is.
Well, tax competitiveness looks at tax systems and see how they are in terms of encouraging economic growth, in terms of attracting businesses and investment. And it compares Canada with 37 OECD countries, which are our peers, other developed nations. But unfortunately, Canada's not doing so well. We rank 20th out of these 37 OECD countries. So we're bottom half of the pack, and Canada has fallen 2 points over the last year.
So what would you say are some other key findings from this report when it comes to Canada in particular?
Yeah, so overall, our tax competitiveness, 20th out of 37, but business tax competitiveness, we're 23rd out of 37, personal taxes, we're 27th out of 37, and property taxes, we're 24th out of 37. So all in all, these measures not looking good for Canada's tax competitiveness.
Did the report highlight anything positive about Canada's tax system at all, sir?
Well, we did have a bright spot, and it's the fact that Canada right now does not have a wealth tax. That would be a very damaging type of tax, which would chase away Canadian residents and chase away assets that we definitely need to be having here, especially as we try to grow our way out of this downturn. And also for everyday Canadians, we have to keep on guard against these so-called wealth taxes, because after politicians would be done soaking the rich, well, where would they look for money next? They would start to come to everyday Canadians and hit us with higher taxes.
All right, Mr. Terrazzano, about a minute left in this interview, but let's talk solutions. What kinds of realistic steps is the CTF recommending officials to take?
Well, especially in light of this tax competitiveness report that shows that we're at the bottom half of the pack on tax competitiveness with our peers, I think it's pretty clear that if politicians really want to get our economy firing on all cylinders again, that they should prioritize tax relief over more government borrowing, right? We don't need these politicians running around spending money that we don't have. Instead of that, just let families keep more of their own money in their own pockets. Let businesses have more of their own money so that they can reinvest in operations and get more Canadians back to work.
All right, Mr. Terrazzano, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Hey, it was my voice.
All right, after the break, we'll be back with a look at top stories from across Canada. Alberta's government tables a bill on so-called captive insurance. Quebec says it will not impose mandatory vaccinations on the education sector. And the Nova Scotia government has introduced a bill to put 28 climate goals into law. These stories and more coming up after the break. BC's government says 2 parliamentary secretaries will work with the village of Lytton to recover from the wildfire that destroyed much of the community. 2 people died in the June 30th blaze that tore through the Fraser Canyon village. It caused an estimated $77 million in insured damage. Jennifer Rice, the Parliamentary Secretary for Emergency Preparedness, and Raleigh Russell, Parliamentary Secretary for Rural Development, will start in their new roles immediately. BC Health Minister Adrian Dix says the province's vaccine card has helped boost vaccination rates, but 10.3% of the population are not yet vaccinated. The province says 89.7% of eligible people 12 and older have received their first dose of the vaccine, and 84.7% have received their second dose. The Alberta government has introduced legislation to give another insurance option for businesses facing high rates. It's called captive insurance, and if passed, Alberta would join British Columbia as the only 2 provinces that allow captive insurance in Canada. Finance Minister Travis Taves tabled the legislation yesterday. He says the bill would help Alberta energy companies and other sectors when global insurance capacity is on the decline. A union representing thousands of employees in Alberta's healthcare sector, including paramedics, says the state of ambulance services in the province is dire. The Health Sciences Association of Alberta says it is at the point where people can no longer be certain an ambulance will be available when they need one. President Mike Parker says conditions have never been this bad. Alberta Health Services says it is seeing an unprecedented increase in emergency calls. They are up 30% this year. But AHS says red alerts may only last a few minutes and do not mean paramedics are unable to respond to emergencies. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe says the province's best days are coming. His government laid out its agenda for the fall session of the legislature. In the throne speech, Lieutenant Governor Russell Marasti spoke of nearly a dozen corporations investing in the province. But he made no mention of any new supports for the COVID-19 pandemic. The speech says the Saskatchewan Party government remains focused on the economy, promising to create 100,000 new jobs by 2030. A staff member at a Winnipeg hospital was in unstable condition yesterday after being assaulted at work. Police say the attack happened at the Seven Oaks Hospital. The Winnipeg Regional Health Authority says staff at the facility are devastated and additional security has been brought in. The provincial government is set to introduce legislation today affecting Ontario's long-term care sector. Long-term care minister Rod Phillips says the proposed law would better protect residents in the sector, which was hit hard by the COVID-19 pandemic. The province says the legislation will cover new accountability and enforcement measures, along with residents' rights. Mr. Phillips has said the government's pledge to provide an average of 4 hours of daily direct care for each resident by 2025 will be included in the legislation. Toronto's transit agency says it will temporarily reduce service on some routes. This as it deals with an expected staff shortage due to its policy that all workers be vaccinated against COVID-19. The TTC says it has developed temporary service plans for when its mandatory COVID-19 vaccination policy kicks in on November 21st. It says it takes into account employees who will be ineligible to work because they're unvaccinated or haven't disclosed their vaccination status. The plans focus on maintaining scheduled service on the TTC's busiest routes. Quebec's health department won't impose mandatory vaccination on the education sector. The department says 90% of staff working in preschool, elementary, and high schools are adequately vaccinated. In colleges and universities, 92% of staff are adequately vaccinated. Union officials confirm rescue crews have found the bodies of 2 missing workers in the debris of a scaffolding disaster at a Quebec paper mill. The contract workers at the Domtar mill in Windsor, Quebec, had been trapped inside a silo 60 meters high since multiple levels of scaffolding collapsed early Tuesday. 5 other workers had been pulled out alive soon after the collapse. Nova Scotia's progressive Conservative government has introduced legislation that would see 28 goals related to addressing climate change enshrined into the law. The legislation calls for the ecological forestry practices contained in the 2018 LaHaye report to be implemented by 2023. Liberal leader Ian Rankin says he generally supports the bill, but thinks the goals for the province's forestry sector should be more aggressive. Meanwhile, NDP environment critic Susan LeBlanc says her party thinks the greenhouse gas reduction target should be pushed from 53% to 58% below 2005 levels. All right, we'll be back after the break with a look at stories from around the world as top oil executives testify to a U.S. House committee and an Associated Press investigation finds systemic torture used in Myanmar. That and more coming up next. India's federal environment minister says setting net zero targets isn't a solution to climate change. Instead, he said rich countries need to acknowledge their historic responsibility for emissions and protect the interests of developing nations and those vulnerable to climate change. India hasn't yet submitted fresh plans for cutting down emissions. The minister said that India is among the few countries on course to reach its target and did so without promised financing from rich nations. Spain's National Statistics Institute says consumer prices increased this month by the country's highest rate in 29 years as a result of soaring electricity costs. Data released on Thursday suggests consumer prices rose 5.5% in October compared to the same month in 2020. Regulatory measures so far haven't contained rising utility bills. This comes amid a global wholesale energy price crunch. The statistics agency says increases in fuel and gas prices also fueled the monthly consumer price hike. Top executives at ExxonMobil and other oil giants are set to testify at a landmark House hearing on Thursday. Congressional Democrats are investigating what they describe as a decades-long industry-wide campaign. They claim it is to spread disinformation about the role of fossil fuels in causing global warming. The much-anticipated hearing will be held by the House Oversight Committee. The hearing has drawn comparisons to a similar high-profile hearing with tobacco executives who famously testified that they didn't believe nicotine was addictive. The European Central Bank is facing the highest inflation in more than a decade. The ECB is also dealing with slowing business activity among the 19 countries that use the euro. ECB President Christine Lagarde has so far viewed the higher prices as temporary. The bank is pumping 1.85 trillion euros into the economy, at least through March. Taiwan must be prepared to defend itself. Taiwan's defense minister said the island cannot depend entirely on other countries to help if China were to launch an attack against the island. Minister Chu Kuo-cheng told reporters that Taiwan must rely on itself, but it would accept any help from international allies. Minister Chu has called the rising tensions between China and Taiwan the most severe he has seen in 40 years. India has test-fired a nuclear-capable intercontinental ballistic missile with a range of up to 5,000 kilometers. This comes amid rising border tensions with China. The government says the Agni 5 missile splashed down in the Bay of Bengal with a high degree of accuracy. The Agni 5 is believed to be able to strike nearly all of China. The UK says a threat by France to block British boats from its ports in a dispute over fishing licenses appears to breach international law. London is vowing to retaliate if Paris goes through with the move. On Wednesday, France announced that it would bar British fishing boats from the French ports starting next week. This if no deal is reached over fishing licenses for French boats in British waters. The UN Special Envoy for Syria says the Syrian government's refusal to negotiate on revisions to the country's constitution is a key reason for the failure of talks last week. Geir Peterson expressed his disappointment to the UN Security Council. He said on Wednesday that the parties also failed to agree to meet again before the end of the year. But he says he will continue to engage with all parties to address the challenges that have arisen, saying that there is an urgent need to produce results. An investigation by the Associated Press has found that the Myanmar military has been torturing detainees across the country. This in a methodical and systemic way since the takeover of the government in February. The AP investigation was based on interviews with 28 people imprisoned and released in recent months, photographic evidence, sketches, and letters. This along with the testimony from 3 recently defected military officials. The AP investigation found that the military has also taken steps to hide evidence of its torture. The Sudanese military official says General Abdel Fattah Burhan has fired at least 6 ambassadors. The state-run Sudan TV also reported the dismissals, which came late Wednesday after the diplomats spoke out against the military's takeover. The coup earlier this week came after weeks of mounting tensions between military and civilian leaders. The province of Manitoba is setting up an endowment fund to help sustain Winnipeg's Upper Fort Garry Provincial Park. The historic downtown tourist attraction and gathering place is known as the birthplace of the province, where Manitoba entered into Confederation in 1870. The Manitoba 150 Host Committee announced yesterday that it is donating $100,000 to the fund. This to help ensure the unique park is preserved for years to come. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your national and international news for today. For more news on demand, be sure to visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and follow us on our social media handles on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time.